Hi everyone, in this video I'll be showing you how to create a simple pivot table, and if you want to download this file you can do so from the link in the description below. So what is a pivot table? Well, basically it's a quick and simple way to summarize a large volume of data, and in this example I'm using a staff list with salary information which I've made up. So before we make our pivot table, we need to check through our data, make sure that the data is formatted consistently, as in numbers are formatted as numbers. There are no gaps where we don't intend there to be gaps, and the first row in each column is labeled up appropriately. So I've got a staff list and my columns are labeled department code, department, etc, etc. So to create our pivot table we need to select any cell within our data, and in the ribbon you would go to Insert and the pivot table button. So if I click on that, now you will see marching ants appear around your data. This is where Excel guesses your data sits, and you'll see that data range listed here in this table range box. So if I click on OK, what happens is Excel will open a new tab. My fields will be listed on the right hand side and my pivot table will be created on the left hand side. So I zoom in a little bit. So we build our pivot table by adding fields. Now we don't want to add every single field because we are creating a summary. So let's add one or two. If I add the department code, click the checkbox next to department, and the department field will appear in my rows box. And you will notice on the left hand side it hasn't listed every record, it's only listed unique values because we are creating a summary. So if I added a second field, say office, click on the tick box, and that field becomes a secondary field underneath the first field I selected. Now some people get confused between the rows and the columns box. All it means is the fields in the rows box will have your data associated down the rows, and any fields in your columns box will have your data associated across the columns. So if I were to use the left mouse button and click and drag the department into the columns box, you will see that the departments are associated across the columns. Now you can see already that my pivot table is already looking like a summary and is missing some values. So let's add the salary field to my pivot table. If I click on the checkbox on that, now the salary field has been added to my values box, and Excel has recognized this field as a numeric field and therefore put that field into the values box. Now sometimes if your field is recognized as a text field instead of a numeric field, then your pivot table will not show a sum of that field, it will show a count of that field. And if that happens, you can change it by right clicking on that box and going to value field settings, and when the dialog box appears you can switch between count and sum. So mine's worked as I intended, so I'm going to leave it on sum. So I'll press OK. So pivot tables are great because if you have someone who likes detail and if you have someone who likes a high level summary, well, you can send them a pivot table in an email, and if they ask for the detail then you can tell them to use the left mouse button, double click on any value, and the detail will appear in a new tab. Okay, so be aware that if you have sensitive data that you don't send that out because that will send with the pivot table. The only way to avoid that is to remove it from your data source and then refresh your pivot table. So that brings me on to two important buttons within pivot tables. In the Analyze tab, the two buttons I'm talking about are Refresh and Change Data Source. So if you change any of your data that links to your pivot table, then your pivot table will not automatically update. You will need to press the refresh button, And if you add any data to your data tab underneath or to the side, then you need to make sure that you change the data source. If I click on it, you'll see my marching ants go down only so far, and Excel will not automatically update. Okay, so I will cover ways around that in a future video. So the other thing you can do, very simple, to make a nice pivot table. If you go into the Design tab, now Excel have set up these pivot table styles where you can click and drop down a number of nice and not so nice patterns. I normally pick one of these medium patterns which aren't too bad, which makes your pivot table a bit more presentable and makes it stand out a little bit. So that's the end of this tutorial. I will do some more advanced pivot table stuff in the future. So if you would like to know more, just leave a comment or message me.